They sang as the bells tolled midnight, and then they were gone. No screams, no echoes, only the faint scent of incense and a single candle still burning. The choir of St. Elara's Cathedral vanished without a trace. Only one returned, carrying a song no one should ever hear. What lies beneath the stone arches of that ancient cathedral is a truth older than faith and far darker than prayer. The cathedral rose from the mist like a silent sentinel, its stone towers swallowed in the fog of a late summer evening. The faint amber of lanterns traced along its arched windows, flickering shadows that seemed almost to breathe. The streets of the village were narrow and winding, cobblestones slick with rain. From them drifted the scent of damp wood, burning tallow, and something older, something that clung to the air like a memory. A figure moved along the outer walls, hands tucked deep in the pockets of a worn coat. He paused at the edge of the square, his gaze drawn upward. The cathedral's facade was alive with texture, weathered carvings, saints staring down with eyes that caught the light and held it. He shivered. There was a chill in the air, but it wasn't from the autumn wind. The villagers spoke in hushed tones as they passed each other. Their whispers floated across the stones, carried away by the wind. They spoke of a choir, of voices that had sung for generations, revered, they said, yet cursed in legend. Some claimed the tradition went back centuries, before the stones themselves had been laid. Children were warned not to listen too closely, for fear of what the old songs might do. Inside, candlelight trembled across the nave. It struck the walls in slow, deliberate arcs, illuminating the worn benches and the carved pulpit where the priest would later stand. The smell of wax and incense was thick, almost suffocating. The light seemed hesitant, as if unsure of whether it should illuminate the sacred space or hide the corners where darkness gathered. The choir members arrived one by one, their robes whispered against the stone floors, the soft rustle mingling with the hollow echo of footsteps. They were ordinary men and women, yet something in the way they carried themselves suggested an ancient ritual etched into the marrow of their bones. Each face was pale, tight-lipped, eyes fixed on tasks that only they seemed to fully understand. A young boy lingered near the back, clutching a misshapen candle. His eyes darted nervously from shadow to shadow. He had heard the stories every villager had, but curiosity had drawn him here. The cathedral was too quiet, but something wasn't right. The old caretaker moved past the pews, his hands trailing over the smooth wood, brushing away dust, as if remembering faces long gone. He muttered to himself, low and rumbling, and the sound carried in the empty space like the distant rumble of thunder. The organist arrived. His fingers hovered above the keys, hesitant, almost trembling. He had been playing here for decades, yet tonight, the notes felt foreign, resistant, as if the instrument itself sensed the weight of the hour. He struck the first chord, soft, hesitant. It reverberated through the cathedral like a distant heartbeat. Outside, the village was silent, windows darkened, smoke curling from chimneys. A lone dog barked somewhere far away, and the sound seemed closer than it should have been, echoing against the stones of the cathedral in a way that made the hair at the back of the boy's neck prickle. The choir assembled near the altar, candles clutched in hands that shook slightly. They glanced at each other with restrained tension, nodding in acknowledgement, but saying nothing. The air grew heavy, and each inhale tasted of wax and fear. And that's when he heard it, a soft hum, almost imperceptible, rising from the stone beneath their feet. At first he thought it was his own imagination, or the settling of the old building, but the hum persisted. It grew in volume and depth, threading through the marrow of the cathedral. It was the kind of sound that made the hairs on your arms stand on end, the kind of sound that made the young boy press his candle closer, as though it could ward off the feeling crawling over his skin. The priest entered, a shadow among shadows, his robe brushing the floor in a rhythm that seemed measured against some unseen clock. He carried a book bound in cracked leather, worn and ancient. His eyes were hollow, scanning the choir, the altar, the walls, and then he spoke, but not a word, a nod, a gesture, and the choir responded. The first notes emerged, soft, trembling. The choir's voices were steadying now, rising, filling the nave with something that was at once beautiful and unsettling. It was music, yes, but it was also an invocation, a memory, a warning. Each note seemed to awaken the stone itself. Shadows shifted, candles flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, long and slow, though no hand had pulled the rope. The boy's eyes widened. The caretaker muttered again, but now his voice carried a note of fear. The organist's fingers moved faster, almost frantically, but the sound remained stubborn, discordant. The choir's song continued, growing in complexity and intensity. The air felt alive, pressing against the walls, heavy with expectation. Outside, the mist thickened. Shapes moved among the gravestones. A crow lifted from the square, wings beating silently against the night. And inside, the choir reached a note that resonated through the boy's chest, through his ribs, into the marrow itself. He stumbled back, tripping over a pew, candles shattering at his feet. The wax hissed and ran, sizzling as it touched the stone floor. Something brushed against the boy's shoulder, fleeting, intangible. He spun, eyes wide, but no one was there. The choir's eyes were fixed forward, faces serene yet tense, as if they were aware of something that the boy could not see. And that's when he understood. This was no ordinary mass. This was preparation, a ritual older than the town, older than the stones themselves. The song was not simply sung, it was expected. It demanded attention, demanded presence, demanded compliance. He wanted to run, but the weight in his chest kept him rooted, as if invisible hands had pressed him into the floor. The candles wavered, shadows stretching and bending unnaturally along the walls. The organist's hands moved more furiously now, but the notes seemed to resist, curling and twisting in the air, settling into the cracks in the stone. And then, a pause. The entire cathedral held its breath. Even the wind outside stilled. The boy dared to look around, to see if anyone else noticed, but the priest remained at the altar, unmoving, expression unreadable. The choir stood silent, eyes forward, as if suspended in the air itself. Something shifted behind the organist. A shadow darker than the rest slid along the stone, brushing the walls with intent. The boy's heart leapt. He blinked. It was gone, but the feeling remained. A presence, cold and patient, tracing each movement, waiting. He looked at the priest again. The book in his hand seemed heavier now, the leather darker, almost slick, as if the pages inside had absorbed something unspeakable. And the choir began again, voices rising in the darkness, carrying a weight that seemed to press against the very air. The boy backed away, his candle long extinguished. The mist from outside crept along the floor, coiling like smoke from a dying fire. The cathedral held its secrets well, and he realized with a sudden cold certainty that once the song began, there would be no leaving until it ended. A shiver ran down his spine. He swallowed. The hum beneath the stones was rising again, and that was when he heard it, not from the choir, not from the organ, not from the priest, but from somewhere deep beneath, low, resonant, patient, something waiting, something that had always waited. The candlelight flickered once more, and then died completely. Silence, heavy and suffocating, fell over the cathedral. The boy pressed himself against the wall, trying to remember the way he had come, trying to find the square outside, the mist, the air that once smelled only of wet stone and smoke. But the darkness was already here, and it was listening. The cathedral loomed through the fog, as if it had grown from the earth itself. Its spires pierced the night sky, jagged and silent, outlined by the faint glow of distant lanterns. A slow wind moved across the square,
carrying with it the scent of wet stone, smoldering candle wicks, and something faintly metallic that lingered at the edges of perception. The streets were empty, save for figures moving with quiet purpose toward the great doors. Choir members, each stepped lightly, careful not to disturb the damp stones beneath their feet. Their robes whispered against the cobblestones, the fabric thin but enough to catch the cold night air. A newcomer among them hesitated at the edge of the square. He was young, recently added to this long tradition. His eyes flicked from figure to figure, faces etched by years, mouths set in thin lines, eyes shadowed but alert. There was something in the way they moved, too deliberate, too controlled, as though each step had been rehearsed for centuries. Candles were placed along the nave, their flames trembling against the draught. The newcomer knelt to light one. The wick caught, flickered, then died. He tried again, same result, but something wasn't right. A subtle draught whispered along the aisles, brushing robes, lifting hair, curling along the edges of the stone floor, and beneath it, faint, almost inaudible, there seemed to be murmurs too soft to understand, too rhythmic to be accidental. He looked up at the older singers. Their faces were calm, but there was tension in their hands, in the way their eyes flicked toward shadows no one else seemed to see. The newcomer wondered if they felt it too, the unease, the weight pressing against the cathedral from somewhere below, somewhere older than the stones themselves. The organist moved to the keys, hands hovering uncertainly. The notes that emerged were careful, restrained, almost apologetic, yet they carried an edge, a hint of unease, that rippled across the nave. One of the older singers adjusted her sheet music. Her fingers shook slightly. She gave a brief, almost imperceptible glance to the priest. He nodded once, not a word, a signal only they understood. The newcomer's attention shifted. A candle along the far wall guttered violently, smoke curling in tight spirals. He thought he heard a voice in it, or a fragment of one, but when he turned, there was only the
Courier, eyes forward, waiting, silent. He moved closer to the altar. The stone floor was cold, unnaturally so. Each step echoed, hollow. The cathedral seemed to breathe with him, the air thickening, pressing at his chest. And that's when he heard it, a low hum, vibrating through the floorboards. It was subtle, almost beneath notice, but it made his teeth ache, made the hair at the nape of his neck rise. The choir members did not flinch. They continued their preparation, adjusting robes, shuffling papers, straightening candles, but their eyes betrayed awareness, flicking briefly to the far corners, as though anticipating something the newcomer could not yet perceive. The priest moved through the nave, inspecting, guiding, never speaking. His presence was commanding, yet void of warmth. The newcomer felt a prickle of fear, small but persistent, pressing in from every side. A door in the side chapel opened. A draught spilled out, carrying the scent of rotting wood, of damp stone untouched by light. The candle flames along that wall shivered, and almost went out, though the air was still, but something wasn't right. The choir began their warm-ups, a note here, a quiet scale there. Voices rose tentatively, harmonizing, testing the resonance of the cathedral. The newcomer noticed a pattern. Every time a note held, shadows seemed to lengthen. Every time a voice trembled, the air shifted, and the older singers remained calm, silent observers to an invisible rhythm. A man in the back, gray hair thin, with hands that shook slightly, adjusted his music. His eyes scanned the nave, as if reading more than the sheet before him. And then he paused, expression tightening, his gaze fixed somewhere above, beyond the rafters. The newcomer followed it, but saw nothing, and that's when he heard it. Not a note, not a hum, something else. A whisper threaded through the drafts, just one word, almost swallowed by the cold. Stay. The newcomer blinked, heart quickening. He looked at the older singers. Their eyes were on him now, and for a moment, he felt every one of them knew what he had just heard. A bell tolled somewhere deep in the cathedral, not the main bell, but smaller, hidden. It echoed once, then paused, as though waiting for a response. The choir did not respond immediately. They adjusted their stance, cleared their throats, and then quietly, in harmony, they began. The sound was pure, melodic, yet threaded with unease. Each note seemed to pull at the air, to weigh it down. The newcomer tried to focus, to remember his breathing, but the shadows seemed to stretch closer with every measure. He noticed subtle oddities, candles that refused to stay lit, shadows that moved against the stone grain, whispers threading through the cracks in the walls. The older singers worked seamlessly around these anomalies, as if accustomed to their presence, but he could not shake the feeling of eyes in the dark, following his every move. The priest turned to the altar, hands resting on the ancient wood. His eyes flicked to the newcomer once, not long, just a brief acknowledgement, yet it made him feel small, exposed. The organist hesitated, then pressed a key. The note rang, pure and cold, vibrating in the newcomer's chest, and then silence. For a breath, nothing moved. Candles flickered, shadows trembled. The choir members adjusted positions, waited, and the hum beneath the stone rose again, subtle, patient, relentless. The newcomer's unease deepened. Something about the cathedral itself seemed to have awareness. It listened, it judged, it anticipated. The shadows had a rhythm now, weaving between notes, brushing against robes, curling over shoulders. He looked around at the choir, noticing a unity he did not share. They were participants, but also observers, witnesses to something that had begun long before they arrived, and would continue long after. And the whispers grew, soft but insistent, threading through the cracks, over the stones, curling around the newcomer's mind. Stay, he swallowed, chest tight. Every instinct screamed to flee. Every part of him knew that leaving was impossible. Not yet, not until the song truly began. The candles wavered again, one guttered, then flared briefly, illuminating the choir's faces, eyes focused, pale, serene, but tense. The newcomer realized the depth of their awareness. The cathedral waited, and he understood, with sudden icy clarity, that the night was only beginning. The shadows pressed closer, and the hum beneath the floor grew louder, and that's when he felt it, just beneath his feet, a subtle vibration, patient, and waiting. The choir members moved into position, silence fell, and the newcomer knew that nothing would be the same after this night. Mist curled along the cathedral's roof, like smoke from a dying fire. The stones gleamed faintly in the lantern light, slick from an evening rain. A slow wind moved through the square, rustling banners, scattering leaves. Inside, the nave waited, cavernous and expectant, as if the building itself had taken a deep breath. The choir had gathered, robes brushing stone, soft footfalls echoing through arches, creating a rhythm that seemed almost alive. Candles flickered along the aisles, casting elongated shadows that trembled with every movement. A young soprano adjusted her music stand near the front. Her hands shook slightly. The light caught her eyes, wide and reflective. She glanced at the older singers. They were calm, or appeared so, but there was tension in the set of their shoulders, the way their fingers lingered on sheet music, as if sensing something in the air that she could not yet name. The rehearsal began, a note here, a scale there. The choir followed the organist, whose hands moved carefully, hesitantly, along the keys, but the notes faltered, not by accident, not by misstep. The music cracked in tiny, unnatural pauses. Silence threaded through the sound, making the hollow space of the cathedral seem deeper, more cavernous. But something wasn't right. Faces twisted, just slightly. A man in the back blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear a vision only he could see. Another shifted his stance, gripping the edge of his music stand with pale knuckles. The soprano froze mid-note, eyes darting toward the shadows behind the pulpit. She whispered, barely audible, "Do you hear that?
The others did not answer immediately. The organist's fingers hovered above the keys. A soft draft moved through the nave, curling around robes, brushing hair, lifting dust motes. It carried with it a sound, faint and rhythmic, almost chanting, soft, persistent, wrong, and that's when he heard it. A murmur threaded between the notes, not part of the music, not emanating from any mouth. It rose and fell with the draft, brushing against the walls, curling over the choir. It was distant, impossible to locate, yet its effect was immediate. The young soprano shivered, eyes fixed on the far window. Outside, someone is chanting, she said. Her voice trembled. Not human. The others exchanged glances, a brief pause, a momentary hesitation that stretched the space between sound and silence. The priest's gaze remained fixed forward, calm, but the air was heavy, weighted with a subtle but undeniable unease. Small items began to shift. Candles along the altar tilted as if nudged by invisible hands. A music stand wobbled, then righted itself. The soprano's sheet music slipped from her grasp, fluttering to the floor. When she bent to retrieve it, it lay on the altar instead, perfectly aligned, as though placed there deliberately. And that's when he noticed it. The shadows moved differently now, not in rhythm with the candles, not with the choir. They stretched and flickered, edges curling, whispering against the stone, creating shapes just beyond perception. The cathedral seemed to pulse subtly, in sync with the chanting outside, with the crackling of the failing notes, with the quickening breath of the young soprano. The organist struck a chord. It reverberated through the nave, bouncing off the stone in uneven bursts. A soft tremor ran through the floor, subtle but present. The choir's voices caught momentarily, faltering, as their eyes darted to corners of the room that seemed darker than before. The young soprano's voice wavered. She stumbled on a note. Her fingers trembled along the keys of the music stand. I think something's here, she whispered. Her words hung in the air, swallowed almost immediately by the architecture itself. The older singers adjusted, trying to regain the flow, but the faltering continued. Notes twisted in odd intervals, harmonies shifted unexpectedly. Even the organist's hands, precise for decades, seemed to hesitate. A candle guttered violently, smoke curling upward in a thick column. The hum of the shadows beneath the stone rose again, subtle but insistent. The air grew cooler. The young soprano pressed her hands to her ears. Her eyes darted, her breath came faster, and that's when he saw it. A small music book, resting on the pulpit moments before, had vanished, then reappeared on the floor behind her. Nothing had touched it, no one had moved, yet it was displaced, as if responding to something unseen. The choir members exchanged quick, fleeting looks. Something was changing. Their composure faltered, though barely perceptible. The weight of the cathedral seemed to press inward, constricting the space, making every note harder to sustain. The young soprano's eyes filled with tears. Her lips quivered. It's outside. I can hear them, whispering, chanting. I can't explain it. The priest moved silently along the aisle, his shadow stretching unnaturally long, cutting across the choir. He adjusted a candle, its flame resisting, but then it steadied. He said nothing, only observed. The organist tried again. The note came, pure, but the discord lingered beneath it. A subtle vibration ran through the floor. Objects shifted slightly again. A book, a candle, the edge of a robe. Small, almost imperceptible movements, but deliberate. And then the shadows responded. They twisted, they grew, they pressed against the choir in a way that was more felt than seen. The air thickened, and each breath became an effort. The young soprano trembled, her music faltering again. A note cracked, then another. The choir faltered in unison. The cathedral seemed to hold its breath, and the whispering continued. Soft, insistent, impossible to locate. Stay, listen, do not leave. The young soprano pressed her hands over her ears. The older singer's eyes were wide now, brief flickers of fear crossing their features before they recomposed. But the newcomer felt it most of all. The invisible weight pressing from the shadows, the chanting outside, echoing through walls thick with stone, the subtle tremors beneath the floor. And that's when he realized this was no ordinary rehearsal. The cathedral had its own rhythm now, one that did not include them. Notes faltered again, sharp and sudden. The choir's harmony wavered, the shadows pressed closer.
The air became almost viscous. The young soprano dropped to her knees, clutching the edge of the pulpit. She whispered, breath ragged, I can't. A candle went out. Silence filled the space, and beneath it, the hum persisted, patient, relentless, waiting. The choir held still. The shadows lingered, and the newcomer understood, with a sudden cold certainty, that nothing here would remain unchanged. The cathedral waited, and they were already too deep inside. Moonlight sifted through the tall, narrow windows, tracing silver lines across the nave. Dust motes floated lazily, suspended in the beams, catching the faint chill of the night. The cathedral was quiet now, save for the soft scrape of robes and the occasional creak of old wood settling. The organist sat at the massive instrument, hands resting lightly on the keys. He was a man who had come close to death more than once, who had seen things at the edge of consciousness that others could not imagine. His eyes scanned the loft above, shadows gathering along the beams, shifting independently of the flickering candlelight below. But something wasn't right. He had felt it first as a tingle along the spine, subtle at first, then insistent, a presence, watching, waiting, not part of the music, not part of the choir, not part of the living cathedral itself. The choir continued to rehearse, voices tentative, careful. A soprano's note faltered and recovered, the pitch trembling, as if uncertain. Another singer adjusted a sheet, hands shaking slightly. Their faces were pale in the candlelight, eyes flicking upward toward the loft, as if sensing what the organist already knew. Something lingered above. One voice, quiet, almost swallowed by the nave, whispered, "It waits, up there, above the vault, watching." The organist's hands froze. The keys felt heavier than before, as though the instrument itself had become conscious of the presence. The air was thicker, harder to breathe. Shadows along the loft shifted again, curling over beams in ways that defied explanation. And that's when he heard it. A soft scrape, distant, like nails drawn lightly over stone. No one else reacted. The choir's voices continued, oblivious, yet the sound had weight, gravity. It pressed against the eardrum, tugging at memory, at something primal buried deep. He leaned closer to the keys. The wood felt cold beneath his fingertips. The organ's pipes trembled faintly, vibrating in resonance with the unseen presence. He had learned long ago that near-death experiences left a sensitivity to the intangible. He could feel it now, a consciousness observing, patient and unbroken. The soprano shivered. Another voice, low and hesitant, echoed softly through the nave. "It's waiting for something." The organist tried to concentrate on the notes, on the music, on anything familiar, but the loft above him seemed to grow darker with each passing moment. Shadows pulled, then stretched, moving against the direction of candlelight, curling downward in a slow, deliberate sweep. The choir faltered, small mistakes, tiny cracks in harmony. The organist noted them, aware that they were not caused by lack of skill or attention. Something else was influencing the space, something unseen, but something wasn't right. He closed his eyes briefly, listening. The hum of the organ merged with a low undertone from above. Not music, not sound entirely, more like vibration, presence, awareness. The whispered voice came again, trembling now. "Do you feel it, up there?" The organist's breath caught. His mind raced through memories of near-death visions, of corridors that opened where none should exist, of figures that appeared on the edge of sight and then vanished. This felt like one of those moments, only closer,
more immediate, real, and that's when he noticed it. A beam overhead shifted, not from the wind, not from the building. Something moved along its length, deliberate. Shadows bent around it. The air seemed to pulse with it, small drafts curling unnaturally toward the floor. The choir tried to continue, but their eyes betrayed them. They glanced upward, hesitated, then returned to their music. Their faces were pale, strained. Even the oldest singers, who had performed here for decades, seemed tense, uncharacteristically rigid. The organist pressed the keys again. The notes were heavy, weighed down by the silent presence. Each chord lingered longer than it should have, resonating against stone and timber, vibrating subtly against the floorboards beneath him. The loft seemed to watch. The shadows shifted again. He could almost feel them focusing, observing, as if the building itself had eyes, and they were trained on him. The small candle at the edge of the loft guttered violently. Smoke spiraled upward in tight, dark coils. The organist held his breath. The choir faltered on a note. Another. The soprano gasped, covering her mouth. The priest's figure remained unmoving, near the altar, expression neutral, presence commanding. The organist wondered if he could see it too, if he too sensed the silent witness above the vault. But the priest gave no sign. And then the loft seemed to exhale. A subtle vibration ran through the pipes of the organ, reverberating against the stone walls. The shadows stretched down further, almost touching the choir's robes. Movement, subtle, deliberate, undeniable. The organist's hands shook. Notes faltered beneath his fingers. His vision tunneled slightly, focus narrowing to the keys and the shadows above. The book slid from a music stand. It landed upright, untouched, its pages fluttering. The soprano cried out softly. The others jumped slightly, murmuring, glancing toward the loft. The organist swallowed. His pulse quickened. He knew fear. He had seen death in strange forms, but this was different. Not mortal danger, not illness, something else. Patient, observant, waiting. And that's when he felt it fully. Not with sight, not with sound, but deep inside, beneath ribs, beneath the bone. Presence, conscious, alive, aware, watching. He glanced at the choir. Their eyes reflected uncertainty now. Shadows bent closer, curling around beams and rafters, almost sentient. The air pressed down. Breathing became effort. The organist's fingers hovered. His mind screamed to leave, to flee the loft and the cathedral itself. That instinct rooted him. Awareness of the presence held him fast. A low hum rose beneath the pipes. The shadows above seemed to respond, stretching, pulsing, waiting. The soprano whispered again, voice trembling, almost inaudible. It knows we're here. And the organist understood. The silent witness above the vault had always been there, patient, waiting, watching. And tonight, it had turned its attention toward them. The organist pressed a key. The note rang out, sharp, trembling against the weight of the unseen eyes. The shadows shifted. The choir faltered, and the cathedral held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The cathedral loomed in the darkness, its spires reaching upward like skeletal fingers against the night sky. Fog rolled in from the village square, curling along the stones and creeping into every archway. Lanterns flared briefly as villagers approached, their footsteps echoing, swallowed almost immediately by the cavernous nave. A bell tolled, deep, resonant, every stroke vibrating through the stone, through the floor, through the marrow of those present. The sound was steady, solemn, insistent. It marked the hour, midnight. The choir moved toward the altar. Robes whispered against the worn steps. Each footfall was careful, deliberate, measured, as if they were walking on the surface of something fragile, something that might break under their weight. Their faces were calm, but pale, eyes fixed forward, mouths set in tight lines. Candles lined the pews of the congregation. Their flames cast wavering light against the stone. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering across the faces of villagers, revealing lines of worry, age, and devotion. The air was thick with incense and cold stone. The smell was sharp and penetrating, almost biting. The organist began a low, steady note, his hands trembling slightly. It carried through the nave, anchoring the space, marking the beginning of what would be called the midnight mass. The choir adjusted their posture, cleared their throats, prepared to sing. The first hymn rose softly, voices intertwined in delicate harmony, the sound filling the cathedral, bouncing against the vaulted ceilings, threading through the rafters. Candles flickered, shadows wavered, the warmth of the flames seemed to pull inward, as though the cathedral itself inhaled with each note. And then it happened. A cold wind, sharp, sudden, sweeping down the aisles. Candles guttered, flames danced wildly, then died. Darkness flooded the nave. The congregation gasped, hands clutching robes, clutching each other. Fear whispered through the pews, unspoken but understood. The choir froze mid-note, breath caught, eyes widened, hands gripped robes, music sheets. Nothing. Their voices faltered. The organist pressed the keys again, but the notes shivered, distorted. The sound seemed to collide with something invisible, something that resisted the music, pressed against it. That something wasn't right. The shadows stretched along the walls, darker than before, moving independently of the dying candles. Shapes curled around arches, along the floor, brushing lightly against robes, against hair. The sensation was subtle, but insistent. The choir felt it immediately. A pressure, as if invisible hands gripped their shoulders, pinned them in place, restrained them. A soprano let out a stifled gasp. She was young, her voice trembling in the darkness. Another singer shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward the rafters. A whisper, barely audible, traveled along the stone. Stay, sing, do not leave. And that's when he heard it. From somewhere above, deep in the vault, a soft scraping, deliberate, not the sound of stone settling, not wind through the eaves. Something moved along the loft, watching, waiting. The congregation knelt in candlelit rows, hands pressed together, lips moving in prayer. But the fear was palpable, radiating, threading through the air. No one dared speak. The candles that survived flickered against stone walls like nervous hearts. The choir resumed, but haltingly. Notes were uneven, harmony fractured. A small tremor ran through the floorboards. The book shifted, candles tilted. One music stand toppled, landing with a muffled thud. No hand had touched it. Eyes darted, faces turned toward the shadows, toward the rafters, toward the dark corners of the cathedral. The air grew heavier, harder to breathe. Each inhalation was a struggle, but something wasn't right. A low vibration hummed beneath the organ pipes, threading through the stone. The choir pressed on, but the music resisted them. Their arms shook, lips quivered, breath came in ragged bursts. A candle at the altar flared briefly, illuminating a figure at the edge of the loft. Just a shadow, blurred, but the presence was unmistakable. Silent, watching, the congregation remained kneeling. No one dared turn. Some clutched rosaries, others clutched each other. Their prayers continued, but quieter now. Fear had threaded through devotion, twisting it into something fragile, tenuous. A gust of wind swept the nave again. Candles went out completely.
Darkness swallowed the choir. Their voices faltered, then rose again, strained and uneven. The organist pressed a key, but the notes shrieked and shivered, barely audible. The choir struggled against the invisible grip. Fingers shook on music sheets. Knees trembled on the stone steps. The loft above seemed to lean closer, shadow pooling against the beams, curling along the floorboards. And then silence. A single note held too long, reverberating like a heartbeat in the emptiness. The choir froze, staring at nothing. The congregation held its breath. The cathedral itself seemed to pause, suspended between moments. A soft whisper threaded through the darkness, near enough to brush the skin. Stay. Watch. The young soprano collapsed to her knees, hands pressed to the stone floor. Others stiffened beside her. The organist's hands trembled above the keys, caught between playing and fleeing. And that's when he understood. This was no ordinary mass, no ordinary night. The invisible force that gripped the choir was patient, watchful. It had been waiting. The candlelight remained extinguished. Shadows pressed against robes, brushing hair, curling along the floor like smoke. The choir tried to rise, to continue, but the weight of the unseen held them down. The congregation whispered prayers, voices mingling in terror, and the cathedral waited for the hymn to end, or for something far worse. Candlelight trembled across the nave, casting long wavering shadows that swallowed the faces of the congregation. The stone walls glistened faintly with dampness, and the smell of burning wax was sharp and almost metallic. The organist's hands hovered above the keys, fingers tense, trembling slightly. Each note pressed into the cathedral like a question that had no answer. The choir began. Voices rose, delicate at first, threading through the cavernous space. Harmonies interwove, pressing against the stone, filling corners that had been silent for decades. The air was thick with incense, with fear, with expectation, and then it happened. One singer faltered mid-note. Her body wavered, eyes widening. Then she vanished. Not a stumble, not a collapse. Nothing remained but a faint echo of her voice, suspended in the air. The note lingered impossibly long, vibrating against the stone walls, as if the cathedral itself were holding it in place. The others froze, breath caught, music sheets slipped through trembling fingers. But something wasn't right. The second singer faltered, a soft gasp, and then gone. Only the harmony remained, disembodied and perfect, reverberating through the arches. The congregation whispered prayers, half understanding, half panic, as the sound of voices continued without the bodies that should have produced them. The organist pressed a key. The note shook, quivered, and held longer than physics allowed. His eyes darted upward, searching the loft, the shadows, the high rafters, empty. The choir's forms were fewer now, yet the sound persisted, and that's when he heard it. A faint shuffle behind him, a candle flared and went out. Darkness pressed in. He could feel it in the stone, in the air, a pressure that made the breath stick in his throat. The voices carried on, perfect, haunting, but without the singers who should have been singing them. The survivor, a young tenor, dropped to his knees at the edge of the altar. He clutched a ledger, fingers shaking violently, and began to write. His pen scratched across the pages, capturing notes, names, sequences, the impossible chain of events unfolding around him. Every line he wrote trembled as much as he did. Candles flickered, guttered, and died one by one. Shadows pulled at the edges of the nave. The congregation's murmurs turned to desperate whispers, half prayers, half panic. Their eyes searched the darkness for the missing, the vanished, the impossible. The choir continued, perfect, disembodied, resonating with a clarity that should have been impossible. Notes flowed in harmony, rising and falling with unnatural precision. The survivor scribbled furiously, unable to stop. He tried to speak, to call for help, but the words caught in his throat. Fear, disbelief, and awe intertwined. A candle fell across the altar steps. It rolled slowly, almost deliberately, clattering into stone. Its flame extinguished. The voices did not falter, not a tremor, not a hesitation. The organist's hands hovered above the keys, unable to play, unable to stop. His eyes scanned the nave, the rafters, the shadows that moved independently of light. The stone walls seemed to absorb the sound, magnifying it, twisting it, turning the choir into a ghostly echo that filled every corner of the cathedral. And that's when he felt it, the weight of absence, the sensation of presence, the understanding that what remained was not only voices, but intention, watching, judging, waiting. The young tenor's pen trembled on the ledger. He wrote names, notes, times, every disappearance etched into the pages, a desperate attempt to anchor reality. But the ledger felt fragile, insufficient,
as if the act of recording could never contain what was happening. The choir faltered again, though only in perception. The notes remained perfect, floating, echoing, unattached to flesh. Each chord resonated in his chest, pressed against ribs, heart, skull. The cathedral vibrated subtly beneath them, stone and mortar humming with resonance not born of music. The congregation shifted in fear. Some clutched each other, others crossed themselves repeatedly, yet no one dared leave. The doors felt distant, the night pressing against the walls. The organist tried a single note. It rang hollow, distorted. The voices did not respond to him. They flowed on, in their own rhythm, precise, indifferent, and then silence. Not the kind of silence that follows sound, but the kind that presses in, heavy and complete, filled with expectation. The voices paused for a fraction of a second. The survivor's pen froze above the ledger. Every eye in the nave turned instinctively toward the loft, the rafters, the high arches. The darkness pulsed, shadows shifted. A subtle vibration ran through the stone floor. One final note rose from the disembodied choir, perfect, sustained, piercing. It seemed to stretch across time and space, an anchor for the impossible. The young tenor whispered, almost to himself, "They're still here. They're all still here." The ledger trembled in his hands, ink smeared, candles guttered again, flames tiny and desperate against the oppressive dark. And the cathedral waited for the next note to vanish, for the next voice to fade, for the impossible to continue. A chill ran through the cathedral as the survivor descended into the crypts. The stone steps were slick with damp worn smooth by centuries of unseen footsteps. The air was thick, musty, smelling of wet earth, decayed wood, and something older, something that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. The shadows of the vaulted ceiling stretched and curved along the walls, echoing each hesitant step. Lantern light trembled against rough stone, illuminating arches carved with symbols almost forgotten. Dust swirled in slow eddies, catching briefly in the weak light. He moved carefully, clutching the ledger to his chest. Every sense was alert, every nerve taut. There almost puifoitris in the whizzing henteries. The scene. Silence pressed against him, not merely absence of sound, but presence, heavy and suffocating. The crypts opened into a narrow corridor, walls carved with shallow grooves, almost musical in their arrangement. He bent to run fingers along them, cold, smooth, calculated, and that's when he noticed the inscriptions, symbols, letters, runes that did not match any language he had ever seen. But beneath the shapes patterns unfolded, a rhythm, a cadence, like a song no mortal was meant to hear. He traced the carvings with trembling fingers. They curved, intertwined, a lattice of sound frozen in stone. The closer he looked, the more he felt the vibration beneath his fingertips, subtle but insistent. A whisper of movement drew his eyes upward. The ceiling of the passage arched high above, carved with further inscriptions. The shapes seemed to pulse faintly in the lantern light, shadows rising and falling in tandem. But something wasn't right. A door appeared, almost hidden, recessed into the far wall. Its frame was etched with more symbols, jagged and flowing, forming words he could almost read. For the chosen voices, the pattern seemed to say, though no voice spoke it aloud. A warning, a promise, a memory of ritual. He pushed the door. It resisted at first, scraping, groaning, then swung open. A chamber lay beyond, air colder than the crypt pressed against him. The floor was uneven, carved with geometric patterns, concentric circles, symbols repeating in spirals. The walls were lined with bas-reliefs, faintly gleaming in the flickering lantern light. Figures sang, mouths open, eyes hollow, hands raised in gestures both reverent and strained. The survivor swallowed. The air felt heavier here, as though each inhalation drew him deeper into the chamber itself. And that's when he heard it, a faint note, low and resonant, vibrating through stone, not played, not sung, felt, a chord that seemed to resonate with something buried in memory, in bone, in marrow. His pulse quickened, the ledger trembled in his hands. The carvings along the walls shifted in perception, not physically, but in effect. They seemed alive, breathing, waiting, their forms twisted in impossible ways, musical notes carved into flesh of stone, harmonies etched across bone-colored walls, every line vibrating with unutterable song. The warning became clearer. For the chosen voices, it pulsed with intent. The chamber was a tomb of sound, a reliquary of music, of ritual. Mortals were not meant to witness it. He stepped further in. His boots echoed faintly against the carved floor. Dust rose with each step, shimmering faintly in the lantern light. Symbols on the walls seemed to follow, aligning with his movement, bending subtly, pulling him inward. Small items, pieces of broken candles, scraps of parchment, shifted slightly as he passed. Not wind, not tremor, but presence, something unseen brushing against him, guiding him, testing him. A deeper corridor led down from the chamber, narrow, low, walls closer here. The carvings were denser, almost suffocating, notes interwoven with symbols, patterns too complex for comprehension, yet hauntingly familiar, like fragments of a memory that never belonged to him. He bent to examine one sequence, fingers tracing lines. A vibration hummed faintly beneath his touch. The sound rose slightly, threading through stone, through air, through marrow, impossible harmonies, a song beyond life. And that's when he realized the chamber had a purpose, a reason. It had been waiting for centuries, for voices, for the chosen, for him. He stumbled backward, chest tight, lantern swinging. Shadows along the walls thickened, stretching toward him, reaching along the carved notes. The air itself seemed to vibrate, resonating with a presence that was patient, deliberate, eternal. The ledger fell from his hands. Pages fluttered, open to lines recording the impossible. Notes, names, disappearances. Yet nothing could anchor reality here. The chamber pulsed softly, almost imperceptibly, like the beat of a
heart beneath stone. The carvings seemed to whisper in rhythm. He could almost hear the notes, impossible harmonies threading through the air. The walls themselves were singing, waiting, watching. He tried to speak, to call for help, but no sound came. Only the vibration beneath him answered. And then the doorway behind him closed with a soft thud. No wind, no hand, just the slow, inevitable certainty of separation. The survivor pressed against the wall, back to stone, eyes wide, lantern shaking, symbols twisted, dancing across surfaces, almost alive in the flickering light. And that's when he understood fully. This was not merely a crypt, not merely a chamber. It was a vessel for voices, for sound, for something older than the cathedral itself. The ledger lay on the floor, trembling pages open, recording a truth that could not be held. And the chamber waited, patient, eternal, watching. Rain fell steadily against the stained glass of the cathedral. Droplets traced the colored panes, streaking scenes of saints and martyrs, distorting them into shapes that seemed almost alive. The survivor stood in the shadowed nave, ledger clutched to his chest, eyes fixed on the altar steps now empty of bodies. He reported what he had seen. Each word trembled, barely audible, carried on the edge of disbelief. The choir, the vanishings, the invisible presence that gripped the mass. Every detail carefully recorded, every name, every note, every impossible echo. Church authorities listened. They nodded, their expressions polite, sympathetic, but eyes hardened. Notes were taken, but not believed. Questions were soft, probing, designed to unsettle, to test the edges of reason. But something wasn't right. Statements were repeated, denials issued gently. You must have been overwhelmed, they said. A combination of stress and candlelight. The mind plays tricks in darkness. The survivors' protests were polite, reasoned, desperate. He spoke of the vanished choir members, the chamber below the crypt, the carved songs no mortal should hear. And that's when he noticed it. Records were incomplete, pages missing, archives with gaps that could not be explained by fire, flood, or neglect. Scholars who had studied the cathedral's history nodded slowly, acknowledging gaps without explanation. Yet when pressed, they dismissed the significance. Records are lost, they said. It happens in buildings this old. Hallways smelled faintly of wax and mildew. The stone echoed too clearly with each footstep. Shadows moved in corners, unnoticed by the clerks, but not by him. He pressed the ledger against his chest. Ink smudged from trembling fingers. The weight of disbelief settled like dust in the air. He sought verification. Letters, accounts, testimonies. Each door closed politely, firmly, with bureaucratic efficiency. Forms requested, papers signed, statements carefully reworded until they became neutral, harmless, inconsequential. The truth was buried beneath procedure, waiting to be ignored. The survivor visited scholars in distant cities. They examined the cathedral plans, its registries. They noted missing volumes, erased footnotes, blank spaces where history should have been. Their conclusions were cautious, curious, but never alarming. Perhaps a clerical error, one suggested, or an omission in record keeping. But he knew otherwise. Every explanation bent the narrative into reason, smoothed the edges of horror into plausibility. He tried to insist, tried to force acknowledgement of the vanishings, of the chamber, of the songs carved into stone. But the world was unwilling to listen. Letters went unanswered. Reports were filed and lost. Investigations were suggested, but quietly abandoned. The survivor's name became a note in the margin of archival files, a cautionary annotation, rather than evidence of truth. And that's when he felt it. The cathedral's presence lingered, reaching beyond stone, beyond bureaucracy, beyond disbelief. Its weight pressed in, persistent. Every gap in the records, every missing page, every polite denial became part of its design. A network of silence, of omission, of control. He returned to the ledger, writing furiously, trying to preserve what could not be officially acknowledged. Candlelight flickered across his pages, illuminating lines of names, notes, and observations. Each word felt heavier, as if ink itself might anchor reality in the absence of witnesses. The clerks moved through corridors, filing papers, nodding, and smiling. They were polite, organized, efficient, but shadows trailed their steps, pressing at the edges of vision, unseen yet tangible. The survivor walked among them, ledger tight in hands, eyes wide, heartbeat rapid, but something wasn't right. He realized the cathedral itself had orchestrated this denial, its history, its bureaucracy, its very stone complicit in silencing the events that had occurred. The vanished choir, the hidden chamber, the voices, none were gone from memory, but all were erased from record. The walls seemed to close slightly, narrowing, shadows thickening. The weight of disbelief pressed down. Silence, bureaucratic and suffocating, filled the spaces between notes, between words, between breaths. The survivor paused at the edge of the nave, ledger open, hands trembling. He looked at the altar steps, empty, cold. The air carried a faint resonance, almost imperceptible, like distant echoes of voices, perfect, disembodied, lingering beyond comprehension. And he understood fully. The truth could be recorded, it could be written, it could be observed, but it could not be acknowledged. The cathedral's history would absorb it, institutions would deny it, scholars would note gaps but never see. And the survivor was left alone. Alone with the ledger, alone with the voices, alone with what the world refused to believe. The candle flickered one last time,
and the shadows waited. Lightning split the sky above the cathedral. Rain lashed the stone, tracing wet rivers down gargoyles and buttresses. The survivors' footsteps echoed across the slick plaza, hurried, uneven, searching for escape. The ledger clutched tightly to his chest, weighed heavier than the storm itself. Thunder rolled, reverberating through the air, through his chest, through memory. Each strike seemed to awaken fragments of sound, distant harmonies, notes remembered but impossible. The vanished choir haunted him, not their faces, but their echoes, perfect, unyielding, disembodied. He ran down narrow streets, past shuttered homes, past puddles reflecting fractured light. Lanterns swayed, flames flickering in rhythm with his pulse. His mind replayed the cathedral, shadows that moved intermittently, inscriptions that vibrated beneath fingertips, voices that should not have existed. And that's when he heard it, a whisper, carried by the wind, soft, insistent, threading through the storm. Not words, exactly, notes, harmonies. The choir's echo, calling, reminding, tethering him to what had been lost. But something wasn't right. He tried to shake the memory, to focus on tangible reality. The rain, the cobblestones, the cold, yet every reflection in the puddles contained more than his own face. Shadows in windows lingered longer than they should. Shapes shifted at the edge of vision, curling as if anticipating movement. He stumbled, knees scraping stone, breath harsh in his throat. Each step forward felt heavier than the last. His mind clung to fragments of faith, the prayers he had once whispered, the hymns that had brought comfort. But now those hymns were corrupted in memory, twisted by absence, by loss, by impossible resonance. The ledger slipped, pages dampening in the rain. He pressed it to his chest, desperately, as though it could shield him from memory itself. Names scrawled on its pages blurred beneath water, but he could see them still in his mind. Every note recorded, every disappearance, every impossible event. He paused beneath a narrow archway. Rain plastered his hair and robes to his skin. His chest heaved, eyes closed, trying to center himself. He heard the wind carry a faint note, familiar, precise, untouched by gravity. It drifted toward him from the direction of the cathedral, insistent, relentless. And that's when he understood fully. Sanctuaries could hide horrors. Places meant to embody faith could contain forces beyond comprehension, beyond redemption. Devotion offered no protection here. Reverence meant nothing. Memory became a cage. The vanished choir's voices played on endlessly in his mind, echoing against stone and thought alike. Each note a reminder of what had been lost, of what had been taken. He could not stop hearing it. Lightning flashed again. The cathedral loomed in the distance, black and towering, its spires jagged against the stormy sky. Windows glimmered faintly, as though watching, waiting. Shadows pooled in its arches, extending beyond architecture, beyond reason. The survivor fell to his knees briefly, chest heaving, rain soaking, ledger and robes alike. Hands clutched at stone, at earth, at anything tangible. Every fiber of his being screamed to flee, yet memory chained him. Every note, every echo, every absence pressing inward. But something wasn't right. Faith faltered. The prayers he had whispered, the hymns he had sung, the rituals he had observed, they were fragile, hollow, ineffective. The cathedral had proven that what was holy could also be terrifying, that devotion could not guard against all things. He stumbled onward, searching for shelter, for understanding, for anything that could anchor him to the living world. His breath misted in the storm, each exhale trembling, heartbeat racing, mind unraveling. He glimpsed reflections in windows, faint, fleeting, human forms that were not his own. And that's when he heard it again, not from the cathedral this time, from inside himself. The perfect, unyielding echo of the choir, notes unbroken, voices detached from flesh, memories of their faces, their faltering, their disappearance, reverberating in rhythm. With his pulse, he pressed the ledger tighter. Wet ink smeared, lines blurred, but the record mattered. It was the only anchor. Yet even as he clutched it, he understood it might not be enough. The storm raged on. The city streets shone with puddles reflecting lightning, twisted, distorted, reflecting something beyond comprehension. He could not distinguish between reflection and memory, between what was real and what had been imposed by the cathedral, by the vanished choir, by the echoing notes that followed him relentlessly. And then he stopped. A shadow moved in a puddle's reflection, shifting against the rain, not his own, not corporeal, watching, patient, waiting. Faith was no longer a shield. Belief had fractured, and the survivor realized he had fled only the cathedral, not the echo, not the choir, not the knowledge of what sanctuaries could hide. He shivered, clutching the ledger, drenched, exhausted, haunted, and the storm pressed closer, and the echoes never left. Moonlight slanted through broken stained glass, scattering fractured colors across the cracked stone floor of the cathedral. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint tang of dust, mildew, and old incense. Outside, trees swayed in a restless wind, branches scraping against walls that had not known care for decades. A group of explorers approached cautiously. Footsteps echoed in the cavernous nave, swallowed almost immediately by the emptiness. Lanterns swung slightly, casting dancing shadows along columns carved with saints and angels. The silence of the place pressed in, dense, almost tactile.
And for a moment, they felt the weight of centuries settle upon their shoulders. The doors groaned as they pushed them open, hinges rusted, yet resistant. Inside, the scent of damp stone, decayed wood, and something indefinably ancient filled their lungs. Candles long burned to nothing. The altar bore nothing but the memory of rituals performed and vanished voices. And then it began, a single note. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, threading through the nave like a whisper carried on a breath of wind, but it lingered, rising, resonating, perfect, sustained, ethereal, a sound that belonged to no human throat, yet carried the precision and clarity of a choir perfected over centuries. The explorers froze. Lanterns shook slightly in hands that no longer felt steady. Eyes darted to the loft, to the shadows, to every dark corner where light failed to reach. But something wasn't right. The note did not fade. It persisted. It wrapped around the columns, curled along the arches, threading through the floorboards and stone. It was alive in a way sound should not be, patient, observant, inevitable. They moved forward, step by cautious step. The floorboards creaked beneath boots, echoing too clearly. Dust swirled in their wake. Each heartbeat seemed amplified in the silence that otherwise held. Then that's when they heard it. A faint second tone, underneath the first, harmonizing, perfectly pitched, unnatural. They turned their heads, searching for a source. Empty. Nothing moved. Yet the resonance persisted, layering above the original note, weaving into something almost unbearable in its perfection. The explorers tried to speak. Their voices felt foreign in the cathedral's vast emptiness. Words faltered, then ceased entirely, as if the sound itself had been absorbed, repurposed. Lanterns flickered, shadows thickened along the edges of perception. One reached for the ledger, brought from archives of the old cathedral, seeking clues, historical context. Its pages trembled, ink smudged from damp. Names, vanished dates, and fragments of hymn scores glimmered faintly in the lantern light. Each note written there seemed to echo in the air, caught and prolonged beyond reality. The lead explorer traced a hand along the pulpit, cold, smooth, unyielding. Every surface hummed with residual vibration, a subtle, underlying rhythm that threaded through stone and air alike. The note persisted, a single, unbroken line of sound that seemed both distant and intimately close. But something wasn't right. They ventured deeper, steps faltered over debris. Dust fell from rafters like slow rain. The note remained untouched by distance, unbroken, insistent. It seemed to respond to movement, altering slightly with each breath. each turn of the head, as though acknowledging presence. In the crypt below, the air was colder still. Ancient inscriptions glimmered faintly in the lantern's glow. Patterns that no mortal could fully comprehend etched the walls, songs frozen in stone, harmonies impossible to reproduce. The explorers felt the weight of them pressing inward, a sensation both auditory and physical, and that's when he heard it. The ledger in his hands trembled, not a tremor of fear alone, but as if something within the cathedral sought to influence its movement. A rhythm formed within the note, subtle yet commanding. It tugged at memory, at understanding, at something deep in the brain and bone. The cathedral itself seemed to breathe in time with it. One explorer whispered, voice breaking, "It's still singing." No reply came. The others shook their heads, unable to speak. Eyes wide, faces pale, the note wound through the nave, up to the loft, around the altar, embedding itself in corners, behind pews, beneath floorboards. It was endless, relentless, perfect. The ledger's pages began to smear, ink spreading in patterns that mirrored the carvings below. Names of vanished choir members, times, dates, sequences of notes, all seemed to dance across the page in rhythm with the unbroken sound. The explorers' breaths came in shallow gasps, synchronized unknowingly with the vibration in the air. But something wasn't right. One step toward the loft, lantern light fell upon it, empty. Yet the note shifted, as if responding, harmonizing with movement, detecting presence. The air thickened, dust hung in place, undisturbed by the swinging lanterns, frozen mid-motion. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. A sudden sound, a door somewhere above, creaked, faint, but layered beneath the constant note. It resonated, amplified, magnified, unplaceable in origin. The explorers spun toward it. Nothing, silence beyond the note. And that's when they understood. The cathedral had not been abandoned in emptiness. It had been waiting for ears, for presence, for recognition, waiting for new listeners to arrive. The note was patient, eternal, and unyielding. It claimed attention, it claimed thought, it claimed memory. The ledger slipped from trembling fingers, landing softly on the stone floor. Ink spread, lines twisting and shifting, echoing the song in impossible harmony. Pages fluttered briefly, though no wind moved them. The note responded, shifting pitch, pulsing with resonance that could be felt in the chest, in the head, in the marrow. They tried to leave. Every step toward the exit felt heavier. The note did not follow, yet it did. It wrapped around perception, wrapped around understanding. Each doorway, each arch, each corridor led them in circles. The cathedral had preserved itself in absence and sound. Shadows pressed along corners, not darkened by light, but intrinsic to the structure. They moved subtly, imperceptibly, following the explorer's gaze, aligning with the note. The air vibrated in complex harmonics. The body felt resonance as much as the ears, and then silence. Not true silence, but a pause, a suspended breath in the air. The note had not ceased, merely shifted in frequency, a singular, perfect, unbroken tone, threading through every stone, every echo, every mind present. The lead explorer whispered, voice trembling, it will never end. A page from the ledger fluttered upward, inked lines shimmered faintly, forming patterns that matched the cathedral's carvings. Names of the vanished choir members, aligned with symbols, harmonies, notes, all resonating with the persistent tone. The explorers realized fully, the song remained. It had outlasted time, disbelief, abandonment. It had survived vanished voices, bureaucratic erasure, fleeing witnesses, and it would endure. Waiting, patient, claiming ears, minds, memories, and the cathedral, empty yet alive, hummed faintly around them. They would carry the note with them, whether they realized it or not. A seed, planted in consciousness, imperceptible at first, yet unstoppable. The ledger lay open, inked names blurred in rhythm with the unbroken tone.
The explorers shivered, hearts racing, lungs tight. The note wound through stone and air and thought, an eternal echo beyond comprehension. And that's when they felt it. The cathedral had not merely waited, it had chosen new listeners, and the song would not let them go. Outside, lightning fractured the sky, rain fell in sheets, but the cathedral's walls held a sound that could not be washed away. Inside, the explorers remained, trapped in perception, aware and unaware. At once, the note threaded through them, intimate, persistent. It was patient, it was eternal, it was the song that remained. Faith and curiosity can invite unseen horrors. The cathedral's song lingers, a philosophical warning about the price of devotion and the unseen consequences of ritual.